Hi, I wanted to give you a sample presentation for what I'm asking for you to do as a group for middle passage. So on the cover slide here, you would have your names and the chapter that you were covering. And even though I've given you sections to cover, you can call them whatever you want and divide them up however it feels natural. I do want to make sure the work is divided evenly, so there might be certain areas, particularly pulling quotes that are key to internalized depression that you might do, that multiple group members might do together. So for this one, the book starts out in chapter 1. The setting is New Orleans in 1830. This is a lithograph drawing of how New Orleans would have looked at that time. See the water and the ships and the downtown buildings. Rutherford Calhoun is the main character. He is writing this as a journal and making journal entries about an experience he's had. This is the first entry, is the first chapter. He originally is from Illinois. I found this image of a slave house in Illinois to give an example of the type of place he may have lived. He was educated by his master, who did not like slavery but liked having staff. So he farmed, and he eventually lost out on an inheritance his brother Jackson gave up and distributed among all the slaves instead of taking it for themselves. He goes to, when he's in New Orleans, he meets Isadora, who, unlike most of the women he knows that are prostitutes or are loose, she's very prim, she's educated, she's a Christian, and she wants to be married, and she thinks she can fix Rutherford. He wants to get away from her, and she tries to blackmail him into marriage by getting his debtor, Papa Zarenge, to force him into it. One thing I'll add is he also then boards a slave ship, an illegal slave ship, in order to avoid marriage. And that's the first chapter, plot-wise. The other characters we're introduced to is Isadora, Papa Zarenge, Santos, and Squib. We don't know as much about them yet, but Isadora we learn quite a bit about, and the other three are mentioned briefly, and we hear from briefly. Isadora, like I said, she's educated, prim. She comes from the north. Her dad was abusive and had killed her mom in a domestic dispute. And so she went to go live with a family in New Orleans and wanted to be a teacher, but ended up being like a nanny instead. She's Christian, and she wants to marry Rutherford Calhoun. Papa Zarenge, he's black, and he's a land and business owner. And he knows that Rutherford indirectly owes him money for not paying rent. And so he is part of the strategy for getting Isadora and Rutherford to marry. Santos is sort of the bodyguard or henchman for Papa Zarenge. There's a funny sort of meeting of him and Rutherford in the street where Santos brings him in to see Papa. Squib is the cook for the ship, the Republic, and it is who Rutherford steals the papers from in order to board the ship. And so him boarding the ship at the end of chapter 1 is sort of the conclusion of that first chapter, and gives us a sense maybe of what's going to happen. We have a sense of foreboding. We know he's telling this as a journal entry after the fact, so we assume that he made it through this adventure, but we don't know what happens in the meantime. And then as far as accepting internalized depression, Isadora says this to Calhoun. It hurts me to see you in such ruin. Really, it does. Half the time I see you, you haven't eaten in 2 days, you're hung over, or someone is chasing you for money, or you've been in a fight. You need a family. You're not common. And I think this is important because she is looking down on Rutherford for his behavior, and sort of oppressing him, like reinforcing this. and he has to decide how to deal with it. And we've learned later in the chapter, a few pages later, he says, if you must know, I didn't feel worthy of her. Her goodness shamed me. So it is part of that he accepts this internalized oppression from Isadora. My favorite quote in this section was the comparison of the family, the Creole family from the Toulouse to Isadora. He says, they were beautiful, she was bookish. They were society, here she was, as the northerner, the object of polite condescension. The Toulouse, in short, could afford the luxury of stupidity, the blind, cow-like, chin-lifted hauteur of beautiful people. And such luxury Isadora had never known. This gives us a real sense and contrast of how Isadora feels in this society and with these people. And I like this idea that somehow Rutherford ferrets out how little substance the wealthy have. So that's my favorite quote. When you're doing it as a group, you could have multiple quotes, as well as quotes that deal with internalized oppression. Okay.